Between cones of stark electric light, the moon rolls its veil. You slip between patrols and their mere brute plodding, weightless as a shadow, or pierce straight through with a spear tip of action poised on its pole of slick manoeuvres connected in the dark. The first and last contact with each mark, a silent restriction of blood to the head, or painless bullet in the brain, adding one more page to the secret book of glory, one more page to Sam's Book of the Dead. In Splinter Cell Chaos Theory, you're made to feel like a covert agent. There's a great book by Jesse Schnell called The Art of Game Design. It's an interesting game design manual of sorts, where he discusses various lenses through which a game can be looked at and thought about. One is what he calls the experience lens. He urges the prospective game designer to ask themselves, what experience do I want the player to have, and how can my game capture the essence of it? I think this is a good way of thinking about games generally, but I would say it's particularly relevant to action games, where feel is so important. The player spends most of their time in those games controlling a single character, moving them, traversing them through levels, fighting with them. It has to feel right, which in this context means giving the player the right experience. When a player controls Dante, they should feel like a stylish demon hunter. When they control Joel, they should feel like a tough and resourceful survivor, struggling against the brutal realities of the new world. I think one of the reasons Splinter Cell Chaos Theory is such a successful game is due to the extent to which almost all of its elements support the instilling of the core experience. The movement, the gadgets, the environments, the enemy encounters. Almost everything in the game feeds into the crowning idea, the core experience, which is making the player feel like a covert agent. More specifically, it gives the player the experience of being a techno-stealth agent, which I promise will make complete sense once you've watched the rest of the review. Let's not delay any longer then. The review is broken down into chapters to make it easier to drop in and out. We've already mentioned that the primary goal of the game is to make the player feel like a covert agent, so we'll start the review by looking into what exactly that means, by filling in some wider context around spies, spec ops and stealth. We'll then move on to a brief discussion about plot and characters, then into the meat of the game, looking at the mechanics. Finally, we'll consider the level design and environments. There's also a brief chapter at the very end about the multiplayer options. So if you're ready, let's begin. In the introduction, I mentioned that, at its core, Chaos Theory is an attempt to give the player the experience or feel of being a covert agent. But you might ask what that means exactly. At times in the first Splinter Cell games, Sam is referred to as a spy, and also talked about in reference to special ops teams. The basic kind of covert action you undertake as Sam in the Splinter Cell games has been going on since the start of human civilization. It has taken a number of different forms, and crucially, has been represented a number of different ways in culture and media, making it difficult to know exactly where Sam Fisher fits in. So let's quickly run through what I promise will be a very brief, and later very useful, history of spies and special ops in relation to Sam Fisher and Splinter Cell. As noted by Ernest Volkmann in The History of Espionage, some of the earliest detailed evidence of covert operations comes from artifacts from one of the first great civilizations, the ancient Assyrians. Not only did the Assyrian army excel at scouting and reconnaissance, but the Assyrians developed a centralized intelligence network known as the King's Eye. This, as far as we know, was a kind of proto-secret police force, and probably the first of its scale to exist. The Assyrian government essentially placed numerous spies into conquered territories. They were known as the King's Messengers, and their cover was as couriers for messages. Tablets from this period have been recovered that contain reports of unrest and dissent in conquered lands, that the king's messenger advises must be stamped out as quickly as possible. The ancient Egyptians also had phases in their history where they seemed to recognise the value of intelligence gathering. They also had internal spying networks, but unlike the Assyrians, they tended to be much less centralised. In Egypt's case, the pharaoh would employ governors residing in far-off lands to construct their own spying network inside their territories and report back their findings. For the Assyrians and this era of Egypt, we're looking at between 1300 and 2100 BCE. You might say, well, that's good to know, but what's that got to do with Sam Fisher? Well, these ideas were taken up and modified by civilizations that came afterwards, and soon, certain roles started to form that begin to look a lot like Sam's. As we tend to do with most subjects when tracing their history, we need to go to the ancient Greeks. I'm going to use Greeks collectively for simplicity, even though ancient Greece was a very loose collection of city-states, which were often at war with each other. Basically, despite their differences, they shared an awful lot of their culture with each other, and certainly in the context of spies, they can be referred to as one group for the sake of convenience. So let's move forward to around 500 BCE. The Greeks had learned the value of intelligence gathering, and were great believers in espionage and covert operations. They developed a system which split covert ops into two roles, the scout and the spy. The scout was almost always an experienced soldier, active in the military, who would be discreetly dispatched behind enemy lines to gather tactical intelligence. So they would record and report on things like placement and number of enemy troops, how well equipped the troops were, how many warships were docked in enemy ports, the terrain around likely battlefields, and so on. The spy, on the other hand, was a civilian who would be tasked with moving to and living in enemy territory under an appropriate cover, usually as a merchant or other kind of foreign trader. And once there, they would collect information and send it in secret messages back home. There was one recorded instance of Greek spies hiding message scrolls inside their walking sticks. Unlike the scout, who focused on tactical intel, the spy would often instead collect political and domestic intel that might be relevant for better understanding or exploiting the enemy in the future. The Romans borrowed this Greek system, as they tended to do, but also adopted many of the other successful models birthed by earlier civilizations. And finally, they made some refinements of their own. One of these was the development of the frumentari. Now these boys drank straight from the glory hose. They were a military intelligence organisation, as well as a kind of secret police, but crucially, like the Greek scout, would often operate as singular agents to gather intelligence, wherever they were needed. They would also carry out assassinations if necessary. They were often masters of combat, masters of disguise, masters of covert operations. They were essentially the first special ops organisation. Nothing in history really came as close to Sam Fisher as the Frumentari until the golden age of human asset spying. We're jumping now way closer to the present. From roughly World War I to near the end of the Cold War, human spies were everywhere. Spy masters controlled networks of both professional and amateur spies, who fed them information from behind enemy lines. In World War II in particular, these spies sometimes did do more than just gather intel. Covert operations, like targeted acts of sabotage, did occur, but these were often counterproductive, as covers would immediately be blown by any explicit violent action. Generally speaking, spies were spies, not soldiers or assassins. This is the kind of spy a lot of us probably think about when we hear the word. A guy in a raincoat sitting on a bench, reading a newspaper, while waiting for his handler to sit down next to him and give him the passphrase. This kind of covert agent has long since faded away though, as we'll get to shortly. Also, though covert messages and even coded messages had long been a part of espionage, formal cryptography also rose in prevalence during the 20th century, in tandem with mass communication devices like the telegraph. Message encryption and decryption became ever more important and ever more complex, and is a subject touched on in both Tom Clancy's novels and the Splinter Cell games. In terms of covert operations, there is one final handover before we reach the modern day. As technology came to the fore during the Cold War and grew in power, efficiency, safety, reliability, etc., surveillance aircraft, drones and satellites all but replaced human asset spying. The age of spy networks, with agents on the ground in far-flung places, died out, and special operations filled the small niche that was left. Basic strategic and tactical information is now easy to obtain with technology. Most covert activities that employ human agents now revolve around the targeted destruction of various militia groups, assassinations, rescue operations and the like. In the modern age, the niche of clandestine operations is now handled by government's military, sometimes on the books and sometimes not, by special units backed by intelligence, which is almost always gathered via technology. The people involved in performing the actual operations are generally soldiers currently serving in a country's military, who apply for a place in one of these special units. To enter, they often have to complete an arduous selection and then training process. Think SAS, Navy SEALs, Green Berets and the like. This is essentially Sam Fisher's role. We got there. Special operations teams are mentioned here and there in the Splinter Cell series. At one point in Pandora Tomorrow, Lambert makes a reference to Delta Force, which is an American Special Forces unit designed as an equivalent to the British SAS, one that specialises in counter-terrorism. In the world of Splinter Cell though, Sam is a former Navy SEAL who is now part of a fictional special unit that consists of operational teams of just one or two people, aided by a secondary team of analysts and experts. Sam's cell consists of Sam as the only actual agent, while Lambert, Grimm and others give him pre-mission intelligence and assist him via comms during missions. This fictional special unit / program that Sam is part of is called Third Echelon, which runs exclusively Black Ops. This just means operations that the government deny responsibility of, and these do actually exist in reality, and follow a long history of governments choosing to sometimes deny the existence of their own spies. For some reason, in the game, this Third Echelon is under the jurisdiction of the NSA, who apparently in the world of Splinter Cell have stopped spying on their own citizens for long enough to free up some resources for Sam and his crew. This is pure Clancy. As we'll look at in the next chapter, Tom Clancy is a military nerd who has a habit of making his characters part of fictional special military units. In reality, special units consisting of a single operator make very little sense. Old world spies often worked alone, but there is a reason special forces units operate in teams. It makes the high-risk missions they have to do much more viable, and the possibility of getting out alive much higher. Many special units have, at their core, operational strategies specifically designed for and dependent on well-organised and well-drilled teams of between 4 and 12 members. As a little extra note, the outrageous, freewheeling spontaneity of many of Sam's missions is also rather wacky. During the plots of most of the 3 Splinter Cell games, Sam is often sent into dangerous places on the fly with very limited intelligence. Again, in reality, Special Forces teams tend to gather large amounts of intel and practice operations extensively before executing them. As Linda Robinson notes in The Masters of Chaos, the US Special Forces rehearsed the Son Tay raid 170 times, having built exact replicas of the relevant terrain and structures to practice with. I mean, poor Sam is dropped all over the place with about 5 minutes notice, even sometimes doing multiple story missions at different locations on subsequent days. Man, give the guy a break. Sam, as a lone operator behind enemy lines, carries more of the spirit of the ancient Greek scout, frumentarii agent, or the much mythologised ninja, but with all the Clancy-esque trappings and cutting-edge tech of an elite special operations soldier. But this is a game, and what matters isn't the reality being drawn on, it's the reality the game can create for itself. Sam is a strange mixture of Frumentari agent, special forces soldier, and, as we'll get into later, futuristic techno-stealth operator, but it's the extent to which the game can package this up and deliver it to the player as a real, whole experience that really matters. Before looking at the game specifically, we'll just have a quick look at covert ops in pop culture, Tom Clancy's novels, and how that all fed into the creation of Splinter Cell. So, we now know a bit about the actual history of people like Sam Fisher, but the way in which those people are represented in popular culture is a highly important part of the brew that went into the design of Splinter Cell. Using covert agents as the protagonists in stories has a fairly long tradition, but it wasn't until after World War II that it really started to take off. In many ways, authors like William Somerset Maugham and Ian Fleming hit the ground running by using many of the conventions of pulp and hard-boiled fiction of the time, but this time with a spy in the leading role, rather than, for instance, a grizzled PI or some other archetypal tough guy. It's hard not to see the almost straight line between Philip Marlowe and James Bond. Planting these kinds of people into thrilling stories naturally led to a mythologisation of them. Some popular spy authors, like John le Carré, kept things a little more grounded in reality, but in the main, as the plots became more thrilling and more extreme, the feats achieved by these heroes began to seem more like tall tales told by a small boy at school than anything close to a believable report of the actions of a spy. This kind of representation trickled through into TV and film. The 90s and early 2000s media in particular seemed to have a fascination with these kinds of characters. Think 24, the Bourne film adaptations, Mission Impossible, and so on. If you've seen any recent James Bond films, you might have also noticed that, for a spy, James Bond does very little actual spying, though he does spend quite a lot of time flipping through the air on motorbikes, shooting up buildings with submachine guns, and finding dramatic, monologue-enjoying bad guys to have physical scraps with. The idea that James Bond, in essence, is supposed to be a covert agent is quite funny. But this wasn't the only thread to be pulled up from post-war pulpy spy fiction. Tom Clancy was one of a number of authors, writing a generation after Fleming, who took some cues from the pulp thriller, fast-paced plotting, action set pieces, and archetypal tough guy lead characters, harder than a slab of granite with a bully dog. But at the same time, Clancy also attempted to ground the high action fiction in a kind of fidelity based on technical accuracy. Clancy started writing in 1982, during the tail end of the Cold War, and his first few novels focus in particular on the political and military tensions between the US and the Soviet Union. Of course, as he continued writing into the 90s, the attention of his books changed, turning more towards the emergent threat of terrorism. But one thing that is consistent throughout his writing career is a penchant for technical detail. As I alluded to earlier, Clancy is a military nerd. Fleming, who actually served in naval intelligence during the Second World War, used his experience as inspiration for telling thrilling tall tales. Clancy, on the other hand, is in love with the actual reality of it, the details, the nuts and bolts of it all. In fact, alongside his novels, Clancy wrote a number of non-fiction books about various aspects of the US military and military science. Though the plots of his novels are obviously fictional, and sometimes involve pretty high flights of fancy, they are also grounded in the verisimilitude provided by technical detail, the bureaucratic structure of institutions, the exact specifications of weaponry, the phase-by-phase description of combat tactics, and so on. Clancy also seems to have a real passion for, and genuine insight into, advanced technology, particularly military technology. In many of his books, he not only describes the function and form of semi-fictional bits of advanced tech, but also explains exactly how they work. Similar to how hard science fiction writers explain the fictional events in their stories, and their fictional sci-fi designs in terms of real scientific principles. This feature of his writing caused him to become known as the leading figure in an emergent genre, the Techno-Thriller. Hopefully you can see how these features of Clancy's writing became sewn into the fabric of Splinter Cell. Before we get into that in more detail, however, it might be a good idea to note that, as well as film adaptations of his work, Clancy had a long-standing interest in video game adaptations, dating all the way back to the late 80s. A number of years before even Ubisoft got involved, let alone before the first Splinter Cell game. Clancy independently developed a number of video games, generally being credited under the name Clancy Interactive, before then co-founding his own video game development company called Red Storm Entertainment in 1996. His first titles were submarine sims based on his Cold War novels, The Hunt for Red October and Red Storm Rising for 8-bit home consoles, released between 1987 and 1990. He developed one more submarine sim game called SSN for PC in 96. He also developed a number of turn-based management strategy games for PC during the 90s, but hit upon a wider audience and acclaim with the release of the tactical shooter Rainbow Six on PC in 98. The game was based on the novel of the same name, which involves the creation of a new fictional US Special Forces unit called Rainbow. Hopefully this idea is now familiar to you. In the game, you play as a team of Rainbow soldiers as you infiltrate buildings and kill bad guys in highly tactical, squad-based gameplay. The designers followed a Clancy-esque philosophy of realism and attention to detail, and you'll note a particularly strong emphasis on the weaponry, tools and tech the soldiers utilise throughout the game. Something of course highly relevant to Splinter Cell. The game was a big success, at least the PC version. The console ports were terrible, but that's a story for another time. This innovative PC game near enough invented the tactical shooter genre as we know it, and was likely a big factor in Ubisoft's decision to acquire Red Storm Entertainment in mid-2000. Ubisoft wasted no time in starting its development of new Clancy-endorsed titles, with one of the first big projects being a sci-fi game originally called The Drift, later transmuting into a forward-looking stealth game with a new name, Splinter Cell. Of course, one of the biggest other streams of influence on the development of Splinter Cell were other stealth games, and that's what we're going to move on to look at now in the next chapter. This will be the last chapter looking at the context which fed into the creation of Splinter Cell, and perhaps the most important one. This is all about the lineage of stealth in gaming, and the strands that became the most influential on the creation of Splinter Cell. So what is stealth in a game? Sometimes it's simply framed as the ability for the player to make progress in a game by avoiding confrontation. So basically, going around enemies rather than killing them. Most early games, which included enemies, almost always involve the player killing them, so early games which break from this trend are sometimes considered proto-stealth games. This is far too broad a definition, in my opinion. I can avoid enemies by running around or jumping over them in Crash Bandicoot. Does that make Crash a stealth game? Obviously not. In order for stealth to work in a video game, there must be some key sense in which the enemies see or don't see the player character based on the way they behave. This can be in the sense that they don't see the player at all, or simply don't see them as an enemy. High-order nerds watching, hi, might point to Castle Wolfenstein's basic implementation of a disguise mechanic as the real starting point. But I'd again argue the coding and design of the game is not sufficient here to give the impression that the enemies no longer see you as an enemy. It's clear they simply no longer attack you once you equip a uniform, no matter how you behave. There are certainly a number of gestures towards stealth in early gaming, but I don't think that any game meets the threshold for true stealth until the original Metal Gear in 1987. It's clear within the context of that game that though the system is very limited, enemies have a line of sight and either see or don't see you based on your movement around objects in the world. But it wasn't until we get to the late 90s that the genre really developed into what we'd recognise as stealth today. Metal Gear Solid was released in 1998, a follow-up to the earlier MSX2 games. It built on the achievements of those titles, developing the emergent stealth genre and carrying it into the mainstream. The implementation of a much more in-depth and believable system of visual cones, detection and evasion were a big influence on the original Splinter Cell. Guards react to Snake, but also to the evidence he leaves behind. They become suspicious of footprints and enter an alerted state if they discover the body of another guard, something of course highly relevant to Splinter Cell. It also incorporated sound into detection, an idea which would become more and more important to the Splinter Cell games as they were refined into chaos theory. A point of particular note, Snake's use of futuristic tech to aid his ability to avoid detection is an aspect also strongly represented in the Splinter Cell games, which is a point we'll explore in much more depth later in the review. Tenchu, Stealth Assassins, was released in the same year, though fittingly went under the radar somewhat. It wasn't the smash hit Metal Gear Solid was, but certainly had its fans, and retains a cult following today. It's a stealth game where you play as a ninja. It seems like such a perfect match of genre and player character that it's a surprise it didn't happen sooner. Unlike Metal Gear Solid, where the levels are arranged in small chunks, usually connected by secure doors, elevators or vents, which Snake slithers his way through one after the other, Tenchu levels are large and open. You play as Rikimaru or Ayame, starting at a particular place in the level. The objectives are usually spread around the map, and once you spawn in, you're free to traverse over to them and tackle them however you wish. Enemy visual cones are not explicit but implied, and you avoid them a lot of the time by using the verticality of each level. One of the key mechanics in Tenchu is the ability to quickly ascend onto rooftops and higher ground in general, and of course drop back down when the time is right. So, as well as blocking line of sight by hiding behind level geometry like in Metal Gear Solid, you can also do it by staying on a different vertical plane to your enemy. It's also the first game I remember playing that featured a specific stealth kill mechanic when attacking an enemy from behind who is unaware of your presence, something which is now an absolute mainstay in games with stealth mechanics. Riki and Ayame are also aided by tech in their own way, but these gadgets are of the esoteric and magical variety, rather than the futuristic devices wielded by Snake. Then, what might be, along with Metal Gear Solid, the most obviously influential game on Splinter Cell, Thief, was released in 1998. This was a good year for stealth. Thief is a stealth classic. Its first-person perspective makes keen observation all the more important, and the sound from patrolling guards travels with surprising realism across hallways and corridors. But even so, there's only so much information available. Garrett also has a number of weapons and devices at his disposal, but in order to get by, the player has to rely on his most effective tool, the shadows. The light and dark system in Thief made a lasting impact on the genre. A light meter, in the form of a gem on the hood, lets the player know how visible Garrett is at any given point. How bright the gem glows correlates to how lit up Garrett is, updating in real time. Shadows are your fortress when danger is your neighbour, and when light wrecks the walls, you're left horribly exposed. This is obviously the inspiration for Sam's light meter, which we'll look at in more depth later. Like Sam, Garrett can also manipulate the light levels in an area, but he does so by dousing torches with a water arrow rather than shooting the lights out with a pistol. Overall, the gameplay flow in Thief contains almost everything that would later go on to define Splinter Cell. Leaning around corners, sticking to the darkness, throwing bottles to make a distraction, creeping up behind guards to KO them from behind, then picking up and hiding their bodies in the shadows. Even the small sections of exploration and traversal in Thief are echoed in Splinter Cell, when Sam is forced to climb into and through vents or zipline across rooftops. Guards in Thief also have a suspicious state, followed by a flat-out alerted state, and like Splinter Cell, the player has to determine how aware of their presence the guards are by their behaviour and what they say to each other. This is particularly true in Chaos Theory. In fact, Thief has rather complex AI guards who react to hints of Garrett's presence with a believability and nuance that's impressive even when played today, and certainly when compared to Chaos Theory. Unlike Splinter Cell, Thief also has levels which contain non-human enemies. This might sound like a big difference, but actually, these less sneaky, more conventional bouts of fighting with mutated animals, or undead, or dinos, yes you heard me, mimic the forced encounters with higher tier enemies in Splinter Cell, where Sam is also forced into a more open, conventional firefight. On higher difficulties, Thief also imposes non-lethal rules of engagement, which is a restriction also used in Splinter Cell in the various games at various points. Thief was obviously a huge influence on Splinter Cell, like it was on every other stealth game that came after it, and I think the influence of Thief on Splinter Cell goes beyond the mechanics, right up into the core experience. When discussing the inspiration for Thief, Paul Neurath, founder of Looking Glass Studios, described an experience he had in childhood.
When I was, 10, 12, one of the things I like doing is just exploring buildings, like poking around buildings that maybe I wasn't supposed to go places you're supposed to go. I just enjoyed seeing what was around the corner and exploring. One particular instance where I was taking swimming lessons at a place in downtown Boston. I was just poking around the health club and noticed that there was a basement. And the door was open, so I went down there. And then there was a sub-basement below that looked like, it was covered in dust and it seemed like no one had been there in years. So, of course, that intrigued me. And then I heard someone coming, it was kind of scary. So I hid in a corner, in a dark corner. And a security guard walks by and is poking around. And, apparently they had cameras or heard something. I don't know how they knew I was down there. But I managed to, stay in a dark corner. And they wandered around and then went back, and I scrambled out of there. And so I had a visceral experience of kind of what it was like to sneak around and hide. And so I remembered back then when we were doing, coming up with the concept of Thief, to me in my mind, I had can we convey that experience, that moment of experience to a player where there's that real tension and fear about getting caught?
Like Splinter Cell, the idea at the heart of Thief is an experience. While Splinter Cell aims to make the player feel like a covert agent, Thief aims to instill the feeling to the player that they are someone trying to avoid detection in a place they aren't supposed to be. This explains not only the similarities between the games, but also some of the differences. Thief is designed in a way that emphasises this slightly different core experience. Garrett cannot fight well. He's not the cool, armed-to-the-teeth super spy guy that Sam is. If you're caught as Garrett by a heavily armed guard and can't get away, you're probably going to die. Splinter Cell can be tense, but not nearly as tense as Thief, because the consequences of getting caught are greater, and so is the fear. Thief is the epitome of hardcore stealth, as unlike in Metal Gear, or Deus Ex, or Splinter Cell, or Hitman, the character you play as cannot fight well conventionally. It's hide or die. If you ain't good at being stealthy, you ain't going to make it very far in the game. Thankfully, as we've just discussed, Garrett's got all the tools and tricks he needs when in the right player's hands. Hitman, Agent 47, was released in 2000, and had a completely different take on stealth. Though staying out of sight was still somewhat relevant in the game, the main method of remaining undetected was to adopt the correct disguises for the area you're in or trying to gain access to. Rather than avoiding enemy visual cones with movement, shadows, or hiding behind level geometry, you hid in plain sight for a completely different stealth experience. It was an innovative game, held back by a number of technical and mechanical issues, but thankfully, a lot of these were worked out by the time Hitman 2 was released, just a couple of weeks after Splinter Cell 1. Though clearly not a strong influence on Splinter Cell, I think the series deserves a mention whenever the lineage of stealth games is brought up, especially because of how, in time, the series would go on to do great things. Perhaps the last game that should be mentioned that came out before the release of the original Splinter Cell is Deus Ex. We've alluded to it briefly already, and it's a little different from the other games we've talked about. Firstly, it's not a stealth game. Well, it is, but only if you want it to be. Deus Ex is a highly innovative RPG with a combat system which completely allows for both a traditional first-person shooter experience and a pretty thorough stealth experience. It's somewhat similar to Splinter Cell, in as much as you've got good guns and can use them if you want to, although in Deus Ex you have the full roster of weaponry you'd expect from an FPS game, and you're not in any way encouraged or penalised for being stealthy. It's simply a choice of approach you can make. The stealth system involves avoiding line of sight using level geometry, with the crouch command reducing your detectability. It also has a reliable and believable shadow system, with JC being considerably harder to spot when you're moving through darker areas of the map. The shadow system isn't as complex or refined as in Thief, but it's there and it works. So much so in fact, that you can play through the whole game in strict stealth, barely ever being spotted by a single enemy, and the multi-route level design is often also highly conducive to that aim for players willing to look for a quiet approach. In Deus Ex, stealth is a choice one can make at any time, and I think it likely that most players tend to blend stealthier passages of play into more conventional firefights to create a balance that fits their own style of play. This sense of freedom is satisfying, and is a point that will recur later on in the review when we consider the scoring system implemented by the Splinter Cell games. Hopefully, by looking at the watershed games that came before it, we now have a better idea of what elements fed into the creation of Splinter Cell. But before moving on, now we know what stealth looked like before Chaos Theory, let's quickly look at where stealth ended up after it. That's right, we're going to talk briefly about light stealth. Perhaps due to the success of the Splinter Cell games, and more likely, the later Metal Gear Solid games, stealth became part of the common language of video games. Stealth pops up all the time in more modern games, but not in the form it takes in Chaos Theory, and certainly not like it was in Thief. Instead, individual, accessible pieces of that stealth language appear in action games as an additional element or option, rather than forming part of the game's core mechanics. Hiding in cover, stealth takedowns, sometimes even a vague shadow system, but as an extra option rather than part of the main gameplay. Stealth became just a flavour one can add to an action game, rather than being integral to a game's identity. There are exceptions. More fully stealth games were certainly made after Chaos Theory, but on the whole they ceased to be the blockbusters they once were, and many of the more successful ones were the ones that made more concessions to the accessibility and ease which began to define light stealth mechanics. So what are light stealth mechanics anyway? Well, these mechanics are light in a couple of key senses. The first is that they are an addition to a more fundamental action or combat system which doesn't require them in order to function fully. The second sense in which they're light is that in these games, successful stealth is not in any way a prerequisite to success in the game as a whole. So basically, you can think of light stealth as being at the opposite end of the spectrum to Thief's hardcore or heavy stealth design. In many ways, games like Splinter Cell and Deus Ex prefigured the light stealth trend, as both Sam and JC are perfectly capable of tearing up enemies in more conventional ways, and particularly in the case of Deus Ex, where stealth is not at all necessary to succeed in the game. But the actual cause of the trend, I think, is more of an organic confluence of other design features that were becoming popular. In the mid to late noughties, sticky cover mechanics became popular, thanks in a large part to the success of the excellent original Gears of War. This mechanic allowed a character to quickly snap in and out of complete cover in the form of conveniently strewn objects in the level. This game design feature, combined with detection behaviours from improving AI enemies, led to the formation of a particular kind of light stealth which has become a mainstay in modern gaming. This is the kind we often see now in many third-person action games. As many gamers will know, Naughty Dog in particular is in love with this form of light stealth, and most of their action games seem to feature it heavily. Light stealth in general is now everywhere, even in RPGs like Persona 5. Even the Splinter Cell franchise effectively became light stealth after Chaos Theory, but that might be a sad story better kept for another time. For now, I think that's the broad lineage of stealth covered, so let's move on to the next part of the review, where we'll start looking at Chaos Theory more closely. In all three of the first Splinter Cell games, the plot is compressed into in-between mission cinematics, which often feature clips from a fictional world news network, along with the mission briefings and the comms inside the missions, where Sam's team react to his intel findings in real time. The content is always distinctly Clancy-esque, a snaking chain of international intrigue, always full of technical details. Plot points throughout the games involve missing CIA agents, growing international tensions, former Spetsnaz enemy operators, power being seized in the chaos of a coup d'etat, and so on, with each mission often culminating in Sam finding intel on the next link in the chain. I'd be impressed if anyone even very familiar with Chaos Theory could summarise the actual plot in its entirety. For the sake of the review, I've mapped it out point by point. This is what happens in Chaos Theory. Japan formed the IDSF, which is basically a cyber warfare wing of their military. This causes tensions between Japan, China and North Korea, leading to the latter two countries blockading Japan's shipping. In real Clancy-inspired detail, the game specifically mentions that both China and North Korea consider the act to be a violation of Article 9 of the Japanese post-war constitution. This is a real thing, and would actually be a credible argument to make in this situation. In response to this, the US, as Japan's ally, dispatch a warship in hopes of making China and North Korea back down and break the blockade. In parallel to this narrative, Clancy has a penchant for developing many plot threads in parallel. An American programmer called Morgenholt has been captured by a Peruvian separatist group led by Hugo Lacerda for his work on the so-called mass kernels, advanced weaponized algorithms. In Mission 1, Sam discovers Morgenholt has been killed and the kernels released, but manages to find out where Lacerda is, on a ship. In Mission 2, Sam infiltrates Lacerda's cargo ship and kills him. A Panamanian bank is implicated in some of Lacerda's crimes. Sam is sent to check it out in Mission 3. He finds a lead in the form of Zakazi, a man who worked with Morgenholt. An unknown party uses the mass kernels to black out Japan and the east coast of the US. Admiral Otoma of Japanese IDSF suggests that China and North Korea are likely responsible. Back to Sam, and it's on to Mission 4. He follows the lead on Zakazi by breaking into his New York apartment, discovering that Displace, a private military owned by his friend Shetland, is protecting it. Sam follows this lead in Mission 5, breaking into Displace headquarters. Here, he discovers that Zakazi has fled to Hokkaido, Japan, under the protection of an arms dealer called Milan Nedic. Well, he discovers the name if you figured out this office microphone bit. Of course, Sam pursues Zakazi, infiltrating Nedic's Hokkaido residence in Mission 6. He kills Nedic, and then witnesses Shetland kill Zakazi and flee. Back to the East Asian standoff, and the US warship sent into the area to break the blockade is destroyed by a North Korean missile. The US readies for war. North Korea claimed the missile launch was unintentional, and so Sam is dropped into the NK battery that fired it to gather evidence in Mission 7. Sam finds out that South Korea were likely responsible for the launch, but North Korea, feeling threatened, invades South Korea anyway. In Mission 8, Sam goes into Seoul, which is now a war zone, to retrieve evidence of the launch before North Korean forces find it. He does this, and also learns that Displace actually actioned the launch by using the mass kernels to manipulate North Korean missile systems. Third Echelon learn that Shetland is holding a meeting with some co-conspirators in a Tokyo bathhouse, and so send in Sam in Mission 9. Sam spies on the meeting, learning that the IDSF were helping Displace all along. The IDSF betray Shetland, and a skirmish between them and Displace erupts in the bathhouse. Sam pursues Shetland through the chaos, eventually confronting him and killing him. In Mission 10, Sam infiltrates the IDSF. He learns that Otomo and the IDSF have gone rogue. They've acquired copies of the kernels from Displace and plan to use them to hijack another North Korean missile and fire it at themselves, sparking a huge international war. Sam destroys the IDSF's capacity to use the kernels, stops Otomo from committing suicide, and then brings him in. No more missiles are fired, and the incident is resolved. In the aftermath, international tensions calm down and are on their way to normalcy. Well, hot dang. Something of a contrast to the plot of most games, huh? Where the story is basically, there's a bad guy and some good guys go and fight him. This one has more twists and turns than the leads behind M. Night Shyamalan's TV set. This almost disorienting amount of detail, I think, actually serves the main experience the game is interested in delivering, the experience of being a covert agent. The world of espionage and intrigue is dense and difficult, and it's hard to ever feel like you're completely on top of what's going on. The world is full of impenetrable shadows, and it's only when something bad pokes its head up into the light that we can finally see it for what it is. This feeling is compounded also by the Clancy-esque techno-thriller themes that lace the game's plot. Advanced weaponry is being developed and harnessed, the consequences of which are hard to predict. You'll notice Sam isn't trying to stop nuclear material being obtained or arms being smuggled. The weapon of mass destruction the game centres on is an algorithm, and of course there's also plenty of jargon and tech babble to keep the sensation of an impenetrable shadow thoroughly alive as you play the missions. The actual objectives Sam has to reach are physical: files in cabinets, computer servers, people he needs to kill. But the ramifications always seem to project out and then melt into this shadowy world of technological intrigue. Splinter Cell Chaos Theory is a game about the experience of being a covert agent, and this core idea is also served in the plot and world building of the game by the Clancy-esque theme of rapidly advancing technology. Rick Lane, in his stellar review of the game, points out how the changes in the tech Sam is surrounded by mission to mission reflect this larger narrative theme. Each mission sees a slight escalation in the technical capabilities of your opponents, and your surroundings become increasingly high-tech as the game progresses. In the first mission, you infiltrate a decaying Spanish colonial fortress, where the light bulbs run on generator power, and the most advanced tech is a laptop. By comparison, the final mission is set deep in the Japanese ISDF headquarters, a place where you can't turn around without seeing rows upon rows of server banks. It's a wonderfully subtle way of complementing the narrative. It's not just that the world around is hard to understand and dangerous, it's that it's becoming harder to understand and more dangerous, as technology gives more and more people the power to do more and more. There is also a nice refraction of this theme in the main character. Sam Fisher's a legend, but he ain't no spring chicken, and at times it seems like he's having trouble keeping up in a world that's starting to move awfully fast. This is complemented nicely by some age-related banter at Sam's expense, peppered into the mission comms, largely perpetrated by Grimm's daughter. On the subject of Sam, I think he's a perfect fit here. Action games don't generally call for deep main characters with long arcs and a poignant backstory, but what they do need is someone likeable and someone who fits believably into the world of the game. In all the games, but particularly in Chaos Theory, Fisher is the right man for the job. Michael Ironside was always cast well as Sam, and his voice has fit the mould better and better as the in-game character has gotten older and more grizzled. The comms which trickle through in the background of every mission are infused with Sam's sardonic comments, dated references, and occasional one-liners. The secondary characters are just that, secondary. They are there to fill in the space around Sam, and they play their roles just fine. They each give a short, optional briefing to Sam at the start of each level, and point out just the crucial mission information over the comms while you continue to play. They are not the relentless helpers and advisors in the same way Snake's codec team are, and I'm for one am glad, as I found the constant interruptions in those games annoying. Okay, that's all for plotting characters. Next up, we're moving on to the game mechanics. We're starting our discussion now of the game mechanics in Chaos Theory. Drawing intelligently from a rich contextual well, and making use of a fittingly Clancy-inspired plot is all well and good, but the mechanics is where the rubber meets the road, and boy does the game do well here. Over the course of the first 3 games, each shining piece of the clockwork mechanism has been crafted and polished to fit flush with the others, and move together in a sweet harmony of perfect motion. Let's start with the movement. Movement in Splinter Cell was always deliberate. Even when performing some of the more athletic manoeuvres, you never flung Sam's limbs around like lifeless tools. It always felt serious and appropriately weighty. It's generally the case that when movement is right in a game, you feel it more than words can wield it, and that's the case here. It feels right. Did you know Sam can actually walk and run like a normal human man, but of course he'll likely be spending most of his time in the crouched position, which enables slower but quieter movement. You'll use it to navigate most of the levels. You'll interact with the world from crouched, creep up on enemies while crouched, grab enemies while crouched, shoot from crouched, and so on. Moving while crouched is the cornerstone of the game's movement. In the original Splinter Cell, crouch movement worked great, felt beautifully and subtly weighted, but suffered from a small problem. When moving in crouched, how quickly you moved depended on how far forward you pressed the left stick. This is assuming you're playing with a joystick. There were 3 distinct gradations, which offered 3 levels of speed, quietness, and precision. The slower ones being quieter and more precise, of course. This is fine and easy to come to grips with, but as you play, you realise it presents some problems. When you move between the gradations, the animation jumps around between a slower and faster version of Sam's crouch walk. As well as being visually awkward, it also has a negative effect on gameplay. Often, when slowly crouch walking a significant distance, you'll accidentally break the threshold into the next tier of crouch walk speed. This not only results in visual choppiness, but also Sam bursting forward slightly in a way you didn't intend. This is also the case when you move from complete stillness into a crouch walk. In situations where you want to move a very small distance forward from a static crouch, even a tiny movement input will engage the full first crouch walk animation and jolt Sam forward in a way that can be awkward and unpredictable. While your feel for these movement gradations does improve as you play, making your movement smoother, the issue never goes away entirely. In the second game, it seems like they added a little fade between the different animations to make the transition smoother, but it didn't seem to make much difference mechanically, and the essential awkwardness remains. For some reason, the movement also doesn't quite have the same feeling of weight it did in the first game. This was all sorted out nicely in Chaos Theory. The feel is back and just right, and though of course I can't know the specifics, it seems as though the designers ditched the 3 distinct movement speeds and took more of a spectrum approach to Sam's movement. When you hold forward, Sam more gradually and smoothly accelerates to a level in keeping with how far forward you press. There are no obvious gradients at all. I'm not sure exactly how they pulled it off, but they ironed out the kinks in Sam's crouch movement beautifully. His basic movement is so smooth, he butters the ground as he passes. Pandora Tomorrow also introduced the little quality of life fix of being able to open doors while moving with a body, which is of course retained in Chaos Theory. Sam climbs, drops, and hangs. He can also shimmy across ledges while hanging. These basic traversal mechanics have been perfectly weighted since the original and remain so. Climbing and dropping also bridges into vent traversal without issue. Yes, the nod to Metal Gear Solid is continued in Chaos Theory, where Sam spends an almost suspiciously large amount of time in vents. Sam can also now grab a close enemy and throw him off a ledge while hanging for an instant stealth kill. Nice. When close to a wall, you have the option of sticking to it. You can then move along it in this stuck state. You can use this to peer around the edge of a wall, into hallways or rooms, but it's also useful for keeping out of the way of a guard that's patrolling a narrow corridor you're in. It's a nice, intuitive mechanic, so good in fact that it prefigured the sticky cover trend which we mentioned earlier. In the original, grabbing or striking an enemy from any angle other than directly behind could cause some awkwardness, but the finer points of grabbing and KOing enemies from different directions has now been polished up in Chaos Theory to the standard you now expect. Different animations allow Sam to KO or kill from any direction, and grabs transition nicely so Sam always ends up directly behind. On that note, there's also a surprisingly large host of lovely animations to visually bridge Sam's movement when using ladders, rappelling down ropes, using the knife, opening doors, climbing up ledges, shimmering through narrow openings, and so on. These model animations have been refined to a point of near perfection in Chaos Theory. The movement in the original Splinter Cell was profound in its own way, but undeniably stiff at times and awkward. But now in Chaos Theory, the starch in the movement of the past has been warmed and worked down to a fine, giving texture, supple as worn leather. The stiffness has transmuted to a smooth firmness and deliberateness. In the hands of an experienced player, one assured action follows the last, in a chain that weaves through buildings, across balconies, and flashes under skylights that trap the moon. You're not that guy playing a game, you're Sam Fisher, moving through the darkness with a secret potency, a spell whispered in the night, a breath melting into air. In other words, the way you move reinforces that core experience. It makes you feel like a covert agent. On a related note, we're going to look now what I would broadly refer to as Sam's moves. These are the extra moves that Sam can pull off on top of his basic movement commands. He has the aforementioned lean around corner strats, so essential in Thief, and well implemented here, though less necessary due to the third person perspective. He can hang and shimmy on pipes and lines. This is often a traversal feature, but also melds nicely into combat through the option to KO enemies directly underneath you, and even shoot in certain contexts. Similarly, Sam's ability to squeeze through narrow gaps most of the time functions as a kind of tense, environment-validating traversal. This is a cue taken up by over-dramatic set-piecey games like Uncharted that try to make traversal seem cool. You may be noticing that with this, the sticky cover, the hanging grabs, the stealth knockouts, there's a lot of the DNA of Splinter Cell's mechanics in modern action games. But unlike in those games, in the Splinter Cell games there are a number of situations where this mechanic blends into combat or can be used as a means of avoiding confrontation and retaining stealth. As with the wire or pipe hanging, this traversal mechanic has been integrated into the core game nicely. Then lastly, but by no means leastly, the iconic split jump. Cool as hell and completely unnecessary, it probably helped sell quite a few extra copies of the original Splinter Cell. They tried a slightly different take on this in the second game, only for that new Coke project to get ditched for the triumphant return of original Coke in Chaos Theory. It's back, and although less emphasised, it's still possible to perform in a couple of spots as a nice little tip of the cap. Pandora Tomorrow added a few other bits and pieces, like the SWAT turn. A lot of these extra little features were nice experiments, but didn't really add anything to the core gameplay, and so were sensibly culled, never making it into Chaos Theory. All in all, Sam is kitted out mechanically with all the movement tools he'll ever need, picking up ones from earlier stealth titles, while keeping a few of his own. This is a fitting toolset for a covert agent, and reinforces the game's core experience nicely. On to the guns, and let's start with Sam's trusty pistol. One of the first things the original Splinter Cell teaches the player is that they can kill the lights by shooting them out with a pistol. As you play through the main game, this strategy will quickly become a mainstay. You slip with ease into a dim corner, but light still lingers. Silenced pistol in hand, you point it at the lamp and in one squeeze furnish the room with fingers of midnight. It's a perfect mechanic for this game, of course. Conceptually the same as the light dousing arrows from Thief, but augmented here by the indefinable joy of pulling the trigger, the mechanical click, the hushed bullet crack muffled by the silencer, and the subtle sound of the glass breaking as the light vanishes. But just as the player is ready to drink this mechanic up, like a cat lapping hot milk, they realise there's a problem. They keep missing their shots for no reason. Well, let's back up, because this isn't actually the problem, it's a bad solution to the real problem. This mechanic, along with the ease of headshotting guards, would make the pistol OP. So, in order to balance it, the game designers had to make firing the pistol riskier, and they did this by adding so much bullet spread you'd think you were hunting grouse rather than Georgian terrorists. This is a joke, kind of. It's more like bullet drift, even though Sam's firing a modern handgun at a target a few yards away, in the presence of absolutely no wind. This made very good sense from a mechanical perspective, but was absolutely baffling in terms of the game's larger context. Every time I'd miss a shot, I'd think, I'm playing as a highly trained Spec Ops agent with cutting-edge tech and weaponry, yet I can't consistently hit a large fluorescent light with a pistol from 10 feet away. This differs from the solution Metal Gear 2 found with its Trank pistol. In that game, the pistol rewards the player with an instant KO for headshots, but not for less accurate shots, and, added to the fact that the guards in that game tend to be more mobile, solves this balance problem in a manner which makes much more contextual sense. Snake and Raiden's aim is flawless. Whether the shot succeeds or not depends only on player skill. The pistol wonkiness in Splinter Cell 1, while a highly functional way to balance the weapon, was obviously too much of a sacrifice for making the pistol work as a game mechanic. Crucially, it also worked against the game's core experience of instilling the feeling of being a covert agent. I mean, what kind of cool Spec Ops spy guy can't shoot a pistol worth a damn? Pandora Tomorrow came up with a half-measure solution, which helped a little, but felt very much like putting a bandage on a bullet wound. The pistol no longer has the bullet drift of a musket ball in a hurricane, but is now affected by significant weapon sway, even when Sam is standing still. This new issue is again half addressed with the addition of a laser sight, which shows you the sway, and therefore allows you to adjust for it by timing your shots. While again, this is functional in terms of gameplay, especially as a means of balancing the light destruction mechanic, it still works against the game's core experience, since it still makes Sam, and therefore the player, seem more like a scrub than a modern-day Frumentari soldier. The game still sows its field with mingled seed here. With training, modern handguns can be fired with great accuracy and consistency at this kind of range, so why can't Sam do it? In order to help nerf the pistol, both games also made some of the lights randomly indestructible, even to grenades, which is of course ludicrous. In Chaos Theory, They've solved both problems beautifully. Firing your pistol is now a much riskier prospect, and not because your aim sucks. Thankfully, Sam's combat skills are now well represented, and he has the near-perfect accuracy you'd expect from a legendary Spec Ops agent, finally aligning the game's mechanics with the core experience in this aspect. The reason the pistol's still risky to use is because, depending on the proximity to the enemy and how well trained they are, many will jump straight into a high alert state after you've fired a round, presumably because they've recognised the sound of a silenced weapon being fired. This makes sense, as silenced weapons are far from actually silent, and also sound quite distinctive to those with experience with them, or those who are trained to recognise them. This is a great solution to the problem of the OP pistol. You can now only use the pistol safely when far away from guards or in noisy areas, and so your ability to destroy lights permanently has been hampered significantly. Luckily, Sam has a new tool to use which fills this gap and definitely completes the rebalancing of this part of the game: the OCP. The OCP is basically an electronic disruption device attached to Sam's pistol, which produces an effect similar to the much misunderstood EMP phenomenon. In simple terms, it temporarily knocks out lights, cameras, and any other electronic item for around 10 seconds or so. This is obviously a handy window, large enough to get by patrol or through a large room before the camera or lights return. It does have a cooldown though, and, along with the transient nature of the effect, contains Sam's ability to manipulate the environment brilliantly well. It solves the balance issues previously mentioned without having to directly nerf Sam or his weapons. In the previous games, particularly Splinter Cell 1, you can very easily take out all the lights and destructible cameras permanently, essentially taking territory in the level, room by room, section by section, creating huge regions where Sam's operational power is amplified and all actual tension is dissipated. The changes in chaos theory mean this OP strat is no longer viable, solving this gameplay issue once and for all. The OCP can also be used to create a distraction from a distance, as any piece of malfunctioning hardware will attract the attention of a guard. It also melds nicely with the new visual mode that highlights electronic devices, which is essentially everything that Sam can likely manipulate with his OCP. Headshotting guards is also a much riskier prospect unless you've thoroughly checked there's no other enemies in the vicinity, which, along with the scoring system, addresses another balance issue present in the first game. We'll get into the scoring system later, as I'm sure you won't be surprised to hear I have quite a lot to say about it. So that's how Chaos Theory solved the easy light destruction problem. But what about the cameras? Unlike lights, cameras could be taken out much more easily when guards are not present or no longer around. Well, in Chaos Theory, all cameras are now bulletproof. This is perhaps the one change made in Chaos Theory we've looked at so far that isn't an obvious improvement. It makes sense in terms of game balance, as it again checks the power of Sam's pistol, and there's a sensible counterweight. Many cameras see in the dark, but all the ones that do give off an infrared beam which allows Sam to see their exact visual range. So when facing a camera, you can check it with your nods. If there's no beam, you know you can get past it by creating and using darkness, while if there is a beam, you know you can see the exact vision cone and so avoid the camera's range through movement. This works great mechanically and brings about a nice game balance, but there's still no real explanation as to why these cameras are magically indestructible in the first place. I think this is one of the few times the player simply has to shrug their shoulders and just roll with it. As we've already intimated, in earlier Splinter Cells, simply headshotting enemies from the darkness was an OP strat. This was true even with the bullet drift in the first game and the gun sway in the second. It meant you had to get a bit closer, and sometimes you'd randomly miss, but particularly in the first game, a lead kiss between the eyes was still by far the most efficient way of clearing out guards. With the lethal use of guns now checked in Chaos Theory by the rebalancing features we mentioned earlier and a scoring system that penalises lethality, a new problem has emerged. Sticky shockers are OP. This isn't nearly as big an issue as the guns were, as Sam is much more limited to how many sticky shockers he has access to per level. But in many ways, though ammo is limited, each individual sticky shocker is considerably more powerful than a bullet was in earlier games. They KO an opponent from almost any range. The effect remains the same when hitting them on any part of their body. They are completely silent whether you hit or miss. They can be fired in quick succession with another sticky shocker or other tools. They even now have the added buff of electrifying bodies of water for more free knockouts. They have literally no risk or downsides. In other words, they feel like a get out of jail free card. Getting 5 sticky shockers in your loadout is like getting 5 free easy knockouts right off the bat. I feel like airfoil rounds should be your ace in the hole, spending one to daze an opponent, which can be followed up with a close range strike to KO or a grab, or using 2 airfoil rounds for a free KO at long range. In my opinion, these should be the strongest tool Sam has for remote knockouts. At the moment, I think sticky shockers disrupt the balance here, making the game a little too easy in places. I think it's a testament to the brilliance of Chaos Theory's systems that invincible cameras and overpowered sticky shockers are the only nitpicks I can make here. Everything else fits and interlocks like clockwork. There are even some nice little tweaks that are easy to forget mentioning, like choosing equipment no longer pausing the game. In Chaos Theory, the player can't escape the tension of their situation for easy thinking time by changing weapons. This is a little change, but one that reinforces that core experience of being a covert agent, with all the pressure and tension that comes along with being deep behind enemy lines. As another small note, having loadout options is nice, but it seems fairly cut and dry to me that this feature should have been taken to its logical conclusion by allowing the player to have complete customization of their loadouts. This could have been done by having a point system. The player could have a certain number of points to spend on their loadout, with more powerful tools being more expensive, and so on. Or perhaps rather than points, since that would be hard to justify contextually, Sam could simply only have enough space in his ninja spandex onesie for so much stuff, and so there could be a slot system rather than points. A customizable loadout system like this might have also been a potential way of nerfing sticky shockers by giving them a high points cost or space cost. But I am considerate of the possibility that there may have been other reasons that a system like this couldn't have been implemented, perhaps due to the nature of Sam's toolkit and its role in retaining the core experience. In any case, the addition of loadout options is of course a nice improvement. Hopefully by now, you've realised the brilliance of Chaos Theory's mechanics is not nested in a single aspect or feature. It all comes together into a complex web, each part complementing the whole, each piece building up the same core experience. This idea was put well by Rick Lane in his retrospective review of the game. There's no standout feature or system that can take responsibility for elevating Chaos Theory above all the other Splinter Cell games, and indeed the majority of stealth games. Rather, it's a complex network of different design inputs, all woven together to create one exquisite whole. This statement will only appear truer as we look more into Sam's gadgets and gizmos in the next chapter. But before moving on, I'll just say a word about another interaction option available to Sam: hacking. Rather than going to the troublesome business of gently persuading a guard to give you the code to a door, or indeed gently persuading a guard to kindly press their eyeballs onto a retinal scanner, Sam can instead go through the perhaps equally troublesome business of having the door lock open itself by manipulating the code. This is packaged to the player as an interaction option to hack, followed by a minigame. Now, I'm a sucker for a good minigame, and although the hacking minigame in Chaos Theory isn't quite as good as the one in Bioshock, for instance, it still works pretty well. What's more, the mechanics and premise of the minigame are framed in a suitably techie way, making this game a lot less likely to break the immersion of the player when they do it. Crucially, it's a great option for Sam to have, which further legitimises the world and environment, as well as Sam. Of course, electronic equipment can be hacked if necessary. A top-tier covert agent shouldn't be stopped by mere door code and have to wait around looking for an opportunity to try and find it. If Sam found the code on his travels, great. If not, it makes sense that Sam is skilled enough and equipped with enough tech of his own to hack electronics on the fly. This can also be done with enemy computers to gain access to more information or functionality, which makes sense. Hacking can also be done at a distance with the EEV, giving the rather slow interaction lots of viability as long as Sam is tucked away in a safe place. Though framed well in the in-game tech stealth context, I think little touches like this hacking minigame also help call to mind some of those tactics that recur in the history of espionage: the Greeks and their hidden message scrolls, the cryptography of World War II, and the battle beneath the physical fighting, the coded battle for enemy secrets. I think that's pretty much everything in this chapter covered, so let's move on now to chapter 6, which looks at something immensely important in stealth games: the mechanics of visual information. Earlier in the review, when discussing Tom Clancy's preoccupation with advanced tech and gadgets, I pointed out how some of Clancy's later novels were often described as techno-thrillers. For whatever reason, no doubt to some extent influenced by Tom Clancy, the idea of technology-led action seemed to trickle down into gaming towards the end of the 90s and start of the 2000s. Of course, the original Rainbow Six, based on one of Clancy's books, is one of the earliest clear examples. But things really started to get interesting once these ideas began to be incorporated into the emergent stealth genre. In many ways, real-life covert operations have always revolved around the uncovering of hidden information. From the ancient spies we talked about earlier, who scouted the secrets of the enemy's military, to the Bletchley Park codebreakers that deciphered Nazi Enigma messages. In fact, Ultra, the codename for the British codebreaking operation, had a number of huge successes, most of which revolved around the uncovering of information pertinent to enemy movements. But by the same token, some of their biggest failures happened when incomplete information was taken to be the complete picture. By 1944, Ultra was reading nearly all of the Nazis' secret radio traffic, and had been so successful and become a technology so relied upon that the Allies began to believe that they had access to the complete information picture. So when, in late 1944, Hitler ordered an all-out attack in the West using only landlines, the Allies were caught off guard, leading to the Battle of the Bulge. So it's fitting that accessing greater amounts of information and how that impacts the way a player proceeds in the game is one of the more consequential ways techno-stealth changed and shaped the stealth genre. Metal Gear Solid was the first true techno-stealth game. The way Snake's tech was merged into the game design and mechanics was groundbreaking at the time and still ripples through modern gaming today. Of course, many other games before this featured advanced or fictional technology, gadgets and gizmos, but these had always only been furnishing. It's only when the stealth genre fully emerged that tech began to become integrated into the core functions and mechanics of a game. This is most important and most relevant to stealth in the way in-game technology affects the way the player gathers and interacts with visual information. In Metal Gear Solid, Snake's technology enhances and to some extent supplants his own senses, and with it, in-game camera conventions. The default view in Metal Gear Solid is top-down, which provides the kind of objective picture of the world a machine might give. This view is further enhanced by Snake's Soliton radar, which gives him access to a detailed layout of the environment in the form of a minimap, and even shows him the visual ranges of both human enemies and cameras. This powerful, tech-enhanced perspective is Snake's default, and has replaced Snake's own senses to the point that the player actually has to press a button to simply look with Snake's own human eyes. On top of this, it's not even likely that this now manually controlled human view will often be used by the player, as the visual information given, though different and useful at times, is considerably more limited than the information Snake's tech can provide. This is a clever bit of game design that seems to merge the player character with their technology in a way that changes core aspects of the game, and in a way that suits the genre. But, although Metal Gear Solid generally does a good job of setting things up for this to work, it is obviously a little jarring at times when playing. No matter how much attention you give to your level design to ensure it fits this scheme, this visual system is bound to throw up instances of annoyance or confusion at times, and a sense of flying blind in moments due to not automatically being able to see what's directly in front of you. Perhaps a small price to pay when giving up your human eyes for tech ones. It's interesting to note how, although Metal Gear Solid 2 does re-implement and refine many of these techno-stealth ideas, it does so while modifying the top-down view for a deft combination of both fixed camera and third-person approaches, which feels and plays in a more conventional and less jarring way. This techno-stealth concept is also touched on in Deus Ex, where you play as a character who's been artificially enhanced by technology. This tech gives the player access to superhuman abilities, some of which also alter visual information. Anyone who's played any of the first 3 Splinter Cell games, the good ones, will already see how this notion of techno-stealth, particularly in terms of visual information, is highly relevant to those games. I mean, Sam Fisher is basically Inspector Gadget. I'd hate to think of him trying to get through an airport metal detector with all the gizmos and Clancy-esque doohickeys he has concealed about his person. And of course we're getting to this, but there's a particularly interesting part of Metal Gear Solid's tech vision that I think it's worth pausing to point out before moving on. I mentioned offhand that due to his tech, Snake can see enemy vision cones. This is easy to take for granted, but it's hard to overstate how powerful this is. Enemy vision cones are the main obstacle in stealth games. They are ultimately what determine whether you're as hidden as the Da Vinci Code or as obvious as a fart in an elevator. They are what separates success from horrible, clumsy failure. In basically all of the stealth games at this time, enemy vision cones, certainly for human enemies at least, were all implicit. You had to figure out, mostly through trial and error, how far and wide enemies could see, and therefore how you'd need to move in order to avoid them. Making them explicit, as in Metal Gear Solid's case, may take away some of the nuances of enemy vision, but at the same time abstracts this human element into a clear and objective geometric shape in a fittingly machine-like way. Moving on now to Splinter Cell. From the very first game, Splinter Cell's great trick is the practically perfect implementation of Tom Clancy-style tech into a specific kind of stealth gameplay. Though I singled out Metal Gear Solid as the first true example of techno-stealth, I would say Splinter Cell refined it, and then with the accumulated improvements in chaos theory, damn near perfected it. Splinter Cell grounds techno-stealth in a much more real world than Metal Gear does. It's some distance away from Kojimaness, as well as the fantasy world of Thief and dystopian future of Deus Ex. It's still a Tom Clancy-inspired game though, with that Clancy vein of macho, cinematic hyperrealism running through its tonal centre. But yeah, even though there are no psycho warriors or techno ninjas slicing guys' hands off, tech is just as crucial and consequential to Splinter Cell as it is to Metal Gear Solid. To carry straight on with the previous discussion, let's consider how Sam Fisher's tech changes the way in which the player accesses and uses visual information, as knowing more about the enemies and obstacles will generally make it easier to avoid them. First of all, we have Sam's iconic triple-lensed nods. Looking like the kind of gizmo I would have imagined a Spec Ops spy guy using when I was 6 years old, Sam still somehow manages to pull them off, apparently also confirming the existence of a third eye which seemingly sits in the middle of his forehead. Firstly, we have night vision. Since light and darkness have a particular mechanical importance in the Splinter Cell games, which we will get onto shortly, the ability to see when it's pitch black is a perfect tool for Sam, which synergizes seamlessly with many other gameplay mechanics and general tactics, like shooting out or switching off lights and luring guards into shadows. A brilliant little refinement Chaos Theory makes to the night vision is the ability to see the infrared beams that night vision cameras give off. In what I think is a conscious tipping of the hat to Metal Gear Solid, this explicitly renders the camera's visual range, allowing you to slip by using nothing else but good movement. This is also important as it reveals which cameras can actually see you in darkness and which ones can't, and is a way for Chaos Theory to deftly rebalance cameras. We've already mentioned how in the previous two games, this balance was a little off. Night vision is a useful tool, but is very well balanced by the fact that visual clarity lowers considerably when using it, and the fact that sudden changes in the light level can practically blind you, since the goggles are completely washed out, even in moderate levels of ambient light. This fact is sometimes deliberately used against you by spotlight or flashlight wielding enemies. The first three games also contain a handful of advanced enemies who are also equipped with night vision, levelling the playing field in an effective and even slightly unsettling way. It seems to call to mind a reversal of fortunes that mimic real-life covert ops. Over the course of the game, you grow so accustomed to the security and the comfort of the darkness that you may begin to let your guard down. In real-life combat, wherever you marshal the least resistance, that's where you'll most be brutalised, and the game echoes this well by introducing these enemies. Next is thermal. Though you're probably not likely to use this as much as night vision, boy am I glad this was added. In this visual mode, objects appear in contrasting colours based on their temperature, so rather than revealing information that has been hidden by darkness as per the night vision, this mode instead alters visual information by highlighting objects that meet that particular criterion. This augments night vision nicely by providing a more reliable way of tracking enemies in the darkness at longer ranges, and sniping them if necessary. You can also obviate some of the night vision's clarity issues by simplifying your perspective in this way to a series of red enemy shapes on a blue background. The other main use of thermal vision is to make out enemies in situations where the field of view is obscured by smoke or steam. This, of course, combos well with Sam's smoke grenades, which offer a secondary kind of cover when darkness is either inaccessible or has been penetrated by enemy night vision. The veracity of thermal vision in Chaos Theory is impressive. Gone are the Splinter Cell 1 days, where human fingers somehow leave thermal traces on keypads but not on light switches, wall mines, etc. This visual mode has been given serious thought in Chaos Theory. I couldn't find any obvious instance of ambient and local temperature differences missed by Sam's thermals. They work when looking through very thin material, like the paper walls in Hokkaido, and true to life, are even rendered ineffective when looking through glass and other heat insulating surfaces. You've got to admit that's cool. The next high-tech set of tools Sam uses to gather visual information are his cameras, the sticky cams he can fire from his primary weapon, and the optic cables he can use to look past closed doors and vent openings. Firstly, let's look at sticky cams. I love sticky cams. In fact, the sticky cams are so well designed and implemented from the very first game that when I started replaying Splinter Cell for the first time in many years for this review, I understood the exact physics of them after only 2 or 3 uses. From the shallow arc they make when travelling through the air, to the exact way they land and set on a wall or ceiling. When they are fired, they travel backwards, sticky end first, in a loose arc until they hit a surface, at which point, no matter what angle they are fired at, they right themselves so the sticky end is flat against the surface before adhering to that surface so the camera faces straight out. You get a feel for all of these physics almost instantly. They are a joy to use. Of course, they also function exactly as you would hope and expect, offering a wide field of view which allows Sam to cover a large room with a single cam. Their functionality was improved in the second game, with sticky cams allowing you to zoom in, as well as use night vision and thermal. Then in Chaos Theory, the sticky cams were merged with the distraction cams from the previous 2 games, meaning all cams allow you to create a sound-based distraction and dispense knockout gas over a short distance. In a wonderful little touch, in many levels you can also gain remote access to certain in-house cameras after hacking into secure computers, which in turn can now be done remotely via the EEV. This gives another great techno-stealth method for Sam to collect visual information, as well as actual knowledge on the location of the cameras, all of which knits seamlessly into the existing mechanics. The last of Sam's visual info gadgets are the optic cables. These have a pedigree in Tom Clancy novels, as well as appearances in a number of other Tom Clancy games. They're such a sensible and natural inclusion, it's easy to forget what a nice touch this is in a stealth game. Perfect from the first game, they remained essentially unchanged through the first trilogy, and represented a perfect marriage of lore-justified technology and gameplay tool. On the subject of lore-justified tech, the intricate 3D maps Sam can access at any time from his op menu makes perfect sense, given the information is well justified in-game as being based on intel, and is obviously a very handy tool to have at hand. One of the great aspects of techno-stealth is the solid lore justifications for these essentially superhuman abilities. This gives a good overview of how Sam's tech feeds into the way the player accesses visual information, but in stealth games, gathering this kind of information about the enemies, the map, obstacles, etc. is only part of the role tech can play. As well as making objects of interest more obvious to Sam, his tech also allows him to make himself less obvious. As in stealth games, altering the enemy's ability to obtain visual information about you is often just as important as gathering visual information about them. I mentioned a little earlier how enemy visual cones are the main method by which stealth is broken, and so another kind of stealth mechanic often used in stealth games are the ones which allow the player to either avoid or modify enemy visual cones. Tenchu, for instance, is all about avoidance. The pre-alert state enemies go into when first spotted, the dash mechanics, the jump techs, the grappling hook and use of verticality are all tools to avoid and evade visual cones. Tenchu gives the player only 2 means of gathering extra information, both of which are deliberately flawed. The ability, like Snake, to manually look in a first-person perspective, and a proximity gauge for the closest enemy. The first means is very limited, as even when manually looking, the shadows only yield so far, and Ricky's visual range, I always use Ricky, sorry Knife Girl, Ricky's visual range is only slightly greater than the majority of enemies. The other way of gathering information is the proximity number. Ricky has a kind of magical ninja sense for the closeness of nearby enemies. As we alluded to earlier, powers like this are hard to justify without the presence of advanced technology. But this magical ninja sense only gives proximity with no clues to direction, and only locks on to one enemy at a time. When playing Tenchu, the player is in a constant wrestling match with hidden information, trying to always leverage the knowledge they have to make workable assumptions about the things they don't know and can't see. The game cultivates this situation as a natural testing ground for visual cone avoidance. By clever use of cover, verticality, and movement mechanics, you can avoid enemy vision cones while getting close enough to confirm locations, patrol patterns, and generally filling in the information gaps. An adept player will have developed an intuitive sense of enemy vision cones and move in such a way through the level geometry to keep themselves as visually obscured as possible. And when detected, when a guard is in that Tenchu-specific pre-alert state, an experienced player will instinctively dash back to disappear once again into the polygonal shadows. Most other stealth games also involve avoidance strategies, but perhaps not in such an involved way as in Tenchu. What many other stealth games also feature, though, are means which allow the player to modify enemy vision cones. Mechanics to either crouch, sneak, or go prone recur in many stealth titles, and effectively limit enemy visual cones, often meaning enemies need to come closer to the player before they're detected. JC crouches, Garrett crouches, Sam crouches, and even has a number of distinct crouch walking speeds, as we looked at. Snake can go prone, and so on, but this is par for the course and generally doesn't rely on tech. There are other non-tech related means of modifying enemy visual cones. The defining mechanic of the Hitman series, for instance, is the ability to disguise 47 by changing his clothing. Hitman also features visual cones which you can avoid, like in Tenchu, but this disguise mechanic essentially allows the player to switch off the cones of enemies when you're dressed appropriately for the area you're in. In the first couple of games, this does indeed feel like a binary on-off switch, but this system became significantly more sophisticated in the fourth mainline game, Blood Money. Many stealth games also have some concept of shadows in which the player can hide, with the result being a large reduction in enemy vision when they look into dark areas of the map in comparison to well-lit areas. The first game to really use this feature as its central stealth mechanic was Thief, arguably one of the best stealth games ever made. We've already briefly touched on this, but it's worth going into a little more deeply. Rather than having the player rely on their intuition on how dark certain areas were, and therefore how well concealed they would be, Thief gave the player access to this information in the form of a gauge on their hood. This light gem gave a strong visual indication to the player on the depth of the shadows they were currently in. Apparent in-game darkness can be misleading, whether due to lighting effects, level geometry, screen brightness, or one of many other factors. Giving the player an objective indication of their concealment in real time was a stroke of genius that left a lasting mark on the genre. One of Splinter Cell's great tricks was to take this idea to its logical conclusion, while at the same time justifying the system in-game through the implications of its techno-stealth setting. In Splinter Cell, rather than a bar which grows lighter or dims depending on the darkness level, Sam, and therefore the player, has access to a completely objective light meter. This meter contains an indicator which specifies the exact light level in the area Sam is in, even as it changes in real time. This knowledge is explained within the first few minutes of the first game, as deriving from photocells on Sam's stealth suit. Not only is the player given a perfect tool to measure light and dark, and therefore the extent to which an enemy's visual cone will be shortened or lengthened, but also a perfect techno-stealth justification for how it exists. This is a perfect mechanic for a stealth game, and almost certainly the defining feature of the first three Splinter Cell games. It can be noted that Raiden's suit in Metal Gear Solid 2 is described in a fairly similar, albeit distinctively Kojima-esque way, and also justifies certain kinds of HUD information the player has access to. But in this case, it only really relates to knowledge of the damage the player character sustained, and unlike in Splinter Cell, doesn't tie into stealth, and therefore the core experience of the game. Back to Splinter Cell and Sam's light detecting suit. This real-time meter refines the system, allowing the player to map the changes to highly malleable enemy vision cones as they change from moment to moment. And the rest of Splinter Cell's mechanics mean that this isn't a passive process. It's not as if the player can only log the current light level and manage accordingly. Rather, in all three of the first Splinter Cell games, the player takes an active role in altering light levels as well. As we looked at earlier, the ability to shoot out or disrupt electric lighting is a key part of these games. It means that all Splinter Cell levels have, on top of their virtual brick and mortar, their buildings, rooms and hallways, a separate but highly connected architecture of light and shadow, another layer to the level, one which can be altered by the player to better suit their needs in the moment. It adds an engrossing and greatly complicating element to every plan you make in an effort to traverse the level. At every moment, you must consider the light levels, as Sam is continually empowered or weakened as he drifts in and out of darkness, and the success of almost every manoeuvre you do will to some extent depend on the current light levels. You begin to love the dark, and the calm, poised state you enter while inside it. There's a strange kind of flow-like state as you bleed into Sam as he bleeds completely into sweet darkness. This unity of in-game setting and game mechanics is impressive and flows perfectly up into that core experience we mentioned at the very start. It makes you feel like a covert agent, like a techno-stealth spy. Finally, outside of modifying visual cones, many stealth games also involve methods to remove those cones by neutralizing enemies. This is no different in Splinter Cell, where nearly every enemy in every game can be either killed or knocked unconscious in a variety of ways. We've already discussed this at length in our section on the weaponry, so I think we can leave it there for that point. We also talked about the ability to destroy cameras in Splinter Cell 1 and 2, and the change made in Splinter Cell 3. But again, since we've covered this nicely already, I'll just point out that this is also, of course, a way to remove enemy vision cones. That covers all the visual stuff, but sound also plays a role, albeit a smaller one, in Splinter Cell. In a similar vein to the photo cells embedded into his suit, Sam also has microphones which read the sound he produces. So again, the soundbar on the hood is nicely justified by Sam's tech. Man, they really thought of everything, didn't they? Sound is the second violin in Splinter Cell 1, 2 and 3. Though not as crucial as sight, sound can give away your position, initially causing guards to investigate an area, but can blow your cover entirely if you're persistently noisy. It can also be used as a tool to draw enemies away from their patrol, like the classic Metal Gear knock, but more often it's another obstacle. Noisy surfaces crop up here and there, very much like the iconic puddle in the first room of Metal Gear Solid, and it's generally better to go slow and reduce noise, rather than attempt to use these surfaces as a means to lure guards. So more often than not, sound is another variable the player must try to control to remain as stealthy as possible. A nice addition made in Chaos Theory is an extra pointer on the soundbar which indicates the ambient noise level in the area. This of course changes as Sam moves from quieter to louder areas, and therefore gives less or more leniency to the amount of noise Sam can make before being overheard by nearby enemies. Some areas are nearly silent, meaning extra attention should be paid to the sound Sam is making at all times, but some places, like the bowels of a ship's engine room, are so noisy that Sam can leap onto metal catwalks while firing silenced weapons without ever being heard. That's all for this chapter. Next up, we're going to look at aspects of the level and encounter design. In all three of the first Splinter Cell games, the solo campaign consists of usually around 10 or so missions, each taking place in different levels. You start each level having been dropped into a quiet alleyway or dark corner, and from then onwards, The player has complete agency over Sam and his mission. Once all the primary mission objectives have been completed, the player must then make their way to an exfiltration point, i.e. one of the pre-arranged places for Sam to be delivered out of enemy territory and onto the plane back home. This structure goes some way into instilling that age-old feeling of being behind enemy lines. Sam has been inserted into the lion's den, just like the Greek scouts, Roman frumentari, and allied spies before him. Level design in Chaos Theory strikes a fine balance between linear game flow and player freedom. The first Splinter Cell had a number of alternate routes for the player to find, but still felt fairly rigid at times. Pandora Tomorrow was also often sharply linear, with some of the missions, like my least favourite Jerusalem, essentially functioning like a large Sam Fisher funnel, pushing you down a single drab enemy and obstacle course until you finally get to the end. Generally, the levels in Chaos Theory do a great job of allowing the player to discover their own path for each level. Levels are a series of linear objectives, but the level design and geometry often creates a satisfying illusion of openness. I think the cargo ship is a great example. When you first enter the level, your mind will naturally spin at the prospect of navigating through all those interconnected rooms, passages and stairways. You unlock knowledge of the level piece by piece, room by room, encounter by encounter. The level is linear, and yet you feel as though you're exploring. This feeling is enhanced once you begin to climb the levels by the presence of multiple routes to any single point on the ship. The Panamanian Bank pulls off this trick to an extent that's actually hard to believe. Due to the mission requiring a circuitous trek around the level, when you first find a way through, you'll naturally stumble across a number of other valid routes you could have taken in a way which instills an impressive sense of freedom. Most of the levels are very good. I would venture to say the cargo ship, the Panama Bank and Hokkaido are perfect. I think the bathhouse and the North Korean base are decent levels let down by their poor last thirds, and Seoul is the only fundamentally flawed level. Having touched on Panama, I'd like to give a little more detail on the cargo ship and Hokkaido levels, as I think all three are different and in different ways showcase the best of what Chaos Theory offers in terms of level design. The cargo ship offers a tense exploration through a dark, leaking honeycomb of interconnected cabin rooms and narrow hallways across multiple vertical levels, complete with alternate sets of stairs and numerous options for approaching a single room or area. The complexity is counterweighted by the intuitive encounter design and many dark spots where the moon's neglect allows shadows to gather. The map design also has a general tendency to gently guide you to the bridge where the first main objective is, though it never feels like it's treading on player agency in any way. Hokkaido carries some of the same flavour, but in a very different package. Rather than a network of rooms to explore, Hokkaido instead sequences rooms and their encounters into a winding, diverse path which branches off and overlaps with itself at various points. While Panama and the cargo ship offer more of a sense of exploration and freedom, Hokkaido gives the player a feeling of flow. Though the level is one of the more linear ones, it never feels restrictive, offering encounters with lots of freedom of approach, as well as technical and mechanical novelties. The mechanical novelties are built into the level itself, embedded perfectly into the environment. Sam can see enemy silhouettes through the paper walls. He can cut open a new entrance point in these walls with his knife and grab enemies through them. Many rooms feature lit candles with a unique light radius and intensity that Sam can blow out. It offers an immersive and seamless stealth experience. While the majority of levels retain a sense of freedom and enjoy a smooth and satisfying linear flow without an oppressive funnel-like design, Seoul is the exception. It feels very much like the aforementioned Jerusalem from Pandora Tomorrow, a linear Sam-catching encounter shoot where you feel your options are limited and are forced into a particular approach for most of the level. There is no gentle guiding here, just a narrow one-way street of linear chunks of level where the encounters lack depth and tend to force action. The issue is compounded by the drones that start appearing partway through. These little buggers patrol stretches of the level from the air, which often cover an entire traversal portion of the map. They come with night vision and a very decent visual range, and so they have to be avoided through movement combined with the OCP if you want to remain stealthy. They are a strange, oppressive presence, similar to the timer in the explicitly timed section in Bathhouse. They feel like a giant broom sweeping you through sections of the linear level, and thereby forcing a quick and less thoughtful approach to the human enemy encounters as you hurry to get through each section and out of the drone's patrol path. It's like having the Mamma Mia! Eye of Sauron on you as you scramble towards Mount Doom. If that wasn't enough, there's even a tank that appears near the end which can't be handled with stealth or guile, and so again, literally forces the player to play a certain way if they don't want to be shot into a fine paste. Funny thing is, despite the flaws in Soul, the game itself is so good, the core mechanics still as perfect as ever, that it's still actually quite fun to play through. It's a noticeable drop in quality, but even at its worst, Chaos Theory is still miles better than many other action games, and its stellar core gameplay carries it through. Going back from the specifics to the general, it's fair to say that trial and error is not nearly as necessary in Chaos Theory as it is in some other stealth games, like Tenchu for example. Due to the game's mechanics, along with Sam's tools and weaponry, interacting logically with a coherent detection system, when you make a plan and follow it through, the results are usually what you'd expect, and when they're not, it's generally because you misjudged the situation or made a mistake in the execution. In the many hours I spent playing Chaos Theory, it was remarkably rare for me to feel as though the game was unfair in its punishment, or that I was detected by an enemy when I shouldn't have been. Trial and error is also less a part of Chaos Theory, due to the fact that, though the game does give you challenges and restrictions at times, it generally doesn't throw bad surprises or severe gameplay changes at you out of nowhere. I think perhaps the only exceptions to this are the drones we mentioned in Soul, and the timed section at the end of the bathhouse level, but trust me, we'll be getting into all of that shortly. On to the AI in the game, and it seems like it's a piece of common wisdom now that the AI in the first game were a little dumb, the AI in Pandora Tomorrow were too touchy, and Chaos Theory got it just right. I would broadly agree with the sentiment, but as I'm sure you can guess, we'll go into a bit of detail about the specifics. Over the course of the first 3 games, the enemies in Splinter Cell have become responsive and convincing in almost any situation you're likely to get yourself into. They don't just react to lights turning off, bottles being smashed, and dead or nearly dead bodies. Guards convincingly notice changes to all objects in their immediate environment that Sam can interact with. They notice when doors are left open, when computers are turned off, when keypads are hacked, when a radio fizzles out, when a camera malfunctions, and so on. Almost every object of interest that you can choose to interact with can leave a trace of your presence, and whether you left it intentionally or not, you can be sure the guards will notice. They also show noticeable increases in the level of alarm and suspicion they are feeling at the signs of an intruder's presence, even while Sam remains technically in stealth. In Chaos Theory, when you do something which draws a guard's notice, they'll investigate more slowly and calmly at first, often sauntering over and giving the area a quick check before moving on. If that same guard is provoked once or twice more, however, they'll be visibly, and often verbally, displeased, often letting the player know that they're pushing it by loudly exclaiming something along the lines of,
"Did I just see something?"
They'll then march more briskly over and investigate more thoroughly, often calling a comrade over to help if there's one nearby. If it's dark, they'll have their torches or flares out and won't go back to their patrols for some time. Keep prodding the bear and the guards will become so high-strung that the next slightly wrong step Sam makes, the merest pin drop will give him away, and open hostility will commence. You really feel like an agent in enemy territory. And of course, better trained enemies tend to get more suspicious more quickly, and so the intensity of an enemy's attention ratchets up as you progress through the game. In a nice touch, better trained enemies that are already suspicious also tend to recognise Sam's ploys before he can action them, like spotting a distraction camera and shooting it before you can release the goodnight gas. But even more so than the previous two games, the guards and their patrols in Chaos Theory are crafted to give you just the right amount of wiggle room. Like some of the aspects of the environment design, the encounter design gives the player the right mix of challenge and leeway to make them feel smart when they lure out a guard those few feet to make that window to slip by. They make the player feel cool when they're able to ghost through a network of interweaving patrols with nothing more than well-timed movement through the shadows. Like with almost all aspects of the game, the encounter design reinforces the core experience. It makes you feel like a covert agent. The humour in their scripted conversations, though often a nice touch, are sometimes so obviously plonked there on the start of the encounter that it does threaten to break immersion at times. You sneak up on a couple of dudes, and they just so happen to be finishing off a wacky conversation before then breaking off into their infinitely repeating patrol patterns. What does work really well though, are situations in-game when two guards investigate a disturbance together while commenting to each other about what's going on. This builds immersion, while also giving hints to the player about the current behaviour and alert status of the guards in a way that makes a lot more sense than having an enemy just randomly talk to themselves about the disturbance that they're currently investigating. In regards to the actual enemy encounters that permeate the levels, I feel that the designers have hit upon a great balance of difficulty and variety, while rarely sacrificing accessibility. The changing nature of the encounters, what enemies are involved, how many, what positions they are in, their scripted movement and or cycling movement patterns, offer the player a nice, continuing level of challenge as they play through the game. This is achieved without sacrificing basic accessibility. By this I mean, even when confronted with a tricky looking encounter, the player can form a good plan on how to deal with it, simply by observing, perhaps using their visual info tools to gather more intel, and then making reasonable conclusions about what will and won't work. The game logic, the game mechanics, and the AI are all internally consistent enough for intelligently made plans to work out without the need for trial and error runs, or having to know some specific piece of knowledge not obtainable simply from good gameplay. Throughout most of the game, the challenge is pitched at just the right level to keep the player in that zone or flow state, where they're stimulated enough to feel satisfied and want to keep playing, without hitting against any sudden difficulty spikes which seem unfair or frustrate them. That is, until the bathhouse encounter, which I'll get into later. A related point I'd like to focus on next is the freedom given to the player in encounters. You're swimming with options on how to deal with the enemies and obstacles in the game. In the Panama Bank, for example, there's a couple of rooms which contain lasers and patrolling guards. You learn through comms, and can learn more through interrogation, that the guards have devices stitched into their clothing which deactivate the lasers as they pass, preventing the alarm from being tripped by the guards themselves. You can, of course, see exactly how this works yourself through the use of sticky cams and close observation in order to better formulate your solution. Now, there's lots of ways to get around this obstacle, and lots of opportunities for a cool moment, but the game never forces you to do it in any particular way. The cold as ice, brass balls approach of ghosting just behind the back of a guard as he walks through is tempting for style points, and I'm sure it would be the preferred method the game designers had in mind, and they could have made it so you had to do it this way, but they didn't. You can shadow a guard all the way through in one go. You can also do it in two halves. You can also lure the guard in a particular line through and shadow right behind. But you can instead grab a guard and shepherd him through with you, or KO or kill a guard outside the laser areas and then carry his body through with you. You can remotely KO or kill a guard while he's in the laser grid to disable the nearby lasers around where he drops. You can also ignore the guards entirely and disrupt the electronics in the lasers with your OCP. The designers realise that in order to give the player that core experience, in order to really feel like a covert agent, the player needs to feel empowered to make their own plans and carry them through. And the mechanics of the game and encounter design are such that, no matter what method they choose, it'll feel cool, and more importantly, it'll feel like theirs. This is a point you'll often see touched on by many great game designers. This careful balance of difficulty, while retaining great amounts of freedom, is an impressive feat. You can contrast the brilliance of Splinter Cell's levels with some of Tenchu's later levels, for instance, which, in order to increase the challenge, restrict the player's freedom. In levels 8 and 10 of Tenchu in particular, the map constricts down into a small funnel with almost no useful verticality. The player is robbed of their usual options as a means of intensifying the challenge of the encounters. The player has to deal with the enemies very directly, in a very specific way. This is an example of a poor way of increasing difficulty, one that the player is only likely to resent. It also, of course, breaks the golden rule. It works against the core experience of that game, making the player feel more like a rat in a maze than a subtle and guileful ninja. Chaos Theory avoids this trap elegantly, except for Soul, which we mentioned earlier, and the last part of the bathhouse, and sort of again in the last level. Okay, since we've nitpicked Soul to oblivion already, let's talk about that bathhouse encounter. The first two parts of the bathhouse level are great. In fact, if the level continued on in the same vein, it would be one of the best levels in the game. Unfortunately, it doesn't. In the last part, heavily armed groups from two factions start an open firefight with each other in the level, in which Sam gets stuck in the middle of. This ends up in Sam having to get through a room where three heavily armed, already alerted, nod-wearing enemies are waiting for him. There is no way to do this encounter stealthily, as the guards know you're coming and are literally waiting for you. The room is small and without usable shadows. There is one way in and one way out. Like in those later levels of Tenchu I mentioned earlier, the player is given no options, and the game attempts to increase the difficulty by placing a heavy restriction on the player's freedom. When I first played this on the PS2 as a teenager, it annoyed me, but coming back to it recently, I assumed I must have missed something. There must have been some other way around, some clever little trick, some hidden vent, some hidden breaker I could pull to knock out the lights, some bit of tech saved just for this moment, some information given earlier on what I could use, but there isn't. You have to fight them conventionally. The only possible way around this fact is by a lot of trial and error. Remember how I said Chaos Theory is great for not requiring trial and error? This encounter reverses nearly every good trait the game has. By reloading the save over and over, you can get down a highly specific pattern of movement under the cover of smoke grenades to cheese through without needing to engage the enemies with your weapons. But even then, the outcome is still dependent somewhat on luck. I call this the impossible encounter, not because of the increased difficulty. When you know it's coming, it's actually not hard, but because of the lack of options. Stealth is not possible. Cleverness and guile are not possible. I think this encounter is a definite flaw in the design of the level. Though we've gone into some depth about why that's the case, I think it's such a bad moment in such a generally stellar game that you don't even need to analyse it. You feel it. It rings out like a bum note in a pure harmony. It's one rare case where the game acts against its core experience. In this room, you don't feel like a covert agent. You feel stupid, you feel dumb, you feel limited, you feel powerless. The game pulls a similar stunt on the player again in the next level, in the heart of the IDSF base, but this time they have an entrenched crawl space you can sneak through to get through while retaining stealth. This is obviously a much better way of designing this kind of encounter, though having your options limited to just one specific method to avoid the firefight is still a big reduction of player freedom. But in context, I think it's much more justifiable than the impossible room in the bathhouse, since Sam has sneaked his way into the centre of a secure area, of a secure area, of a secure building. My final axe to grind level design wise happens right after the impossible encounter in the bathhouse. If that wasn't bad enough, from there you go straight into a timed section where you must defuse 3 bombs while having to deal with a heavily armed enemy between each defusal. As pointed out by Boulder Punch in his video on Chaos Theory, link is in the description and I recommend checking it out. This feels like it's from a completely different game, and for all the wrong reasons. Having an explicit timer in this game, forcing you to hurry your movements, is antithetical to everything this game embodies. The gameplay in Chaos Theory revolves around exploring your options, using your tech to patiently observe the environment, forming plans about how to deal with a situation, waiting for the perfect moment to strike. A timer ruins all of that, reducing the game to the campaign of a generic third-person shooter. This is similar to the drones that spoil the party in Soul. The player needs time and space to exercise their freedom and agency. I think, for whatever reason, the game included this section as it felt it needed something akin to a boss battle when Sam confronts Shetland, though I've no idea why. I think they'd reinforce that core experience of being a covert agent much more strongly here if they made it possible to sneak up on Shetland despite his well-trained guards, and put a hole in the back of his head without him ever knowing you were there. If the game designers felt it important for us to hear out Shetland's justification for his actions and admission of guilt, that could be done by Sam overhearing conversations or enemy comms without the need for a cheesy action movie scene where they each have a gun pointed towards each other in a Mexican standoff on a rooftop. These points though about Soul, the bathhouse and the IDSF levels are all small faults in the facets of an otherwise glimmering gemstone. The blemishes stand out because the levels as a whole are so well made, with some of them, like the aforementioned Panama Bank, Cargo Ship and Hokkaido levels, being some of the best action game levels I've ever played through. Okay, so level nitpicking is over. It's time to move on now to look at the scoring system. After every mission, the game gives you a score to mark you on your performance. This was introduced in the second game, and was an addition that I never really liked. Or rather, I didn't like the parameters that determine your score, which we'll get into shortly. There are some very good points to this scoring system. It definitely does give the player extra motivation to go back through the levels, to retry encounters, experiment with different strategies, finesse their routes, and so on. But I think this is at the expense of something important, which is the freedom the player has to determine for themselves what approach feels right in the context of their experience of playing as a covert agent. Before explaining my position further, I think it's useful to briefly sum up how Chaos Theory scores the player. I like to think of it as the player basically starting with a perfect score of 100%, but then suffering a loss of percentage points for various actions the game considers to be wrong or faulty. You are deducted points for enemies killed, enemies alerted, bodies found, alarms raised, and bonus objectives missed. I think the latter 4 things there make perfect sense, but enemies killed doesn't, especially when this is scaled up to cover the total amount of enemies that occupy a level. If you think about it for a moment, the scoring system suggests that KOing every single guard is equivalent to not touching a single one, and weirdly, better than a single completely hidden kill. This is a little odd. I think it was made this way to disincentivize lethal gameplay, and thereby nerfing the headshotting strats that were so potent in the previous two games. But I think, in scoring the player this way, the game is imposing a particular playstyle on the player. It is effectively saying that there is a right and wrong way to play. This seems at odds with the game design itself, which seems to value freedom of approach, but more importantly, is not quite in touch with the core experience of the game. The scoring system essentially rejects the opinion of players who have a different idea of what's appropriate for a covert agent. It may encourage them to play in a way that doesn't give that experience as fully as it could be given. The confusion around this tension is summed up by a quote from a contemporaneous review of the game. In terms of combat, the first two games in the Splinter Cell series contained a slight contradiction. While they emphasised stealth, Sam Fisher was in possession of the equipment and the abilities to kick some serious ass. This is not a contradiction. This is the game giving the player exactly the right tools to make a valid choice about their playstyle. If their lethal weapons and tools are ineffective, and therefore stealth is the only obvious and effective way of playing, then in what sense are they making a free choice to be stealthy rather than loud? In order to make a meaningful choice, both options have to be useful. I believe this is showing a misunderstanding of what the game is and what it's trying to do. Players don't choose to be stealthy because the game makes them. They want to do it because the game excels at rewarding that choice through its core experience. We've mentioned this many times already, but it's worth repeating. When using the stealth mechanics and strategies, Splinter Cell makes the player feel like a covert agent. That's why they play stealthy, and that's why they enjoy playing stealthily more than going loud. But the trick that Chaos Theory misses here is that what exactly this looks like in terms of knockouts and kills is going to vary from player to player. Not every player will naturally agree with the implied attitudes of the scoring system. It also, in a strange way, denies the player having the fun they want to while playing. Basically, doing cool is punished by the implied values of the points-based scoring system. I mean, sneaking up on a guard and then headshotting him in just the right spot so that his limp corpse slips quietly into a pool of water, effectively killing and hiding a body in just one perfect move, or performing the rare grab-kill variation where Sam is lying in wait in a body of water and hooks in a nearby guard to drown them as they silently struggle in his arms. I mean, this is all cool as hell, and in my mind, definitely the kind of stuff a covert agent like Sam would do. So why does the game punish the player for doing it? And with the water grabbing, ledge grabbing, etc., I mean, why even put these cool environmental stealth kills in the game if you're going to mark the player down for using them? Especially as they seem like exactly the kind of cool a covert agent like Sam would do. The game is marking you down for having the kind of fun the game itself proposes you have. In the original Splinter Cell, generally only alarms failed a mission. The player was free to pursue the kind of playstyle that gave them the fullest experience of being a covert agent. With this scoring system, I feel like Chaos Theory was making me choose between being a good Boy Scout for the 100% score, or to sacrifice my rating so I can be true to myself and my fly as hell kill strats. Generally, I ended up playing every mission multiple times, so I could play with complete freedom and then later go for the 100%. Though every time I blew some hapless guy's brains out, I swear I could sense the game wagging its finger at me like a teacher telling off a naughty kid. It's not a huge flaw by any means, but to summarise, I think kills which don't break stealth should not compromise your score. Maybe they could put in a special little badge or grade for the player if they ghost the level, but still, some players will naturally pursue that playstyle anyway, so I really don't think it's necessary. Obviously, in preparation for this review, I've played the first 3 Splinter Cell games extensively over the last couple of months, and boy, have I sneaked through a lot of office buildings. Let's talk briefly about the environments in Chaos Theory and how they've improved on the previous games. Though Splinter Cell 1 is highly functional gameplay-wise and fun to play, some levels feel sterile, blocky, and, well, gamey in their visual design. The Tech offices demonstrate this most clearly, with many rooms making up each section, feeling almost like they've been procedurally generated from the same template. Even levels which seem cool on paper are a little let down by their room-to-room sterility and drabness, like the snowbound nuclear reactor. Though not hugely different graphically, the second game included different kinds of locations, which seemed to open up new stealth possibilities. There were definitely some strong atmospheric design choices here and there, like the section inside the nuclear sub, but unfortunately, I think this potential for new stealth opportunities was left mostly untapped. A number of missions in Pandora Tomorrow take place in a jungle environment. The jungle is a perfect stealth setting, but perhaps for a different stealth game, with different systems, as perhaps proven by Metal Gear Solid 3. In Pandora Tomorrow, though very tantalising at first, the jungle environments feel like they don't quite live up to the potential they seem to promise. The intuitive, environment-specific additions to the stealth mechanics for a jungle location that seem to pop into your head when thinking about it weren't implemented. The first is, how could it not be, the long grass. In my mind, the long grass which carpets a lot of the level, allied with a dense, hot mist that blooms beneath the jungle canopy, should give you pockets of cover equatable to shadow, limiting enemy visual cones and providing a kind of cover to Sam when he's in it. That doesn't seem to be the case, and even if it was, Sam's suit wouldn't be able to measure the depth of cover like it can with darkness, which is perhaps one of the reasons why it wasn't implemented in the end. Instead, the game uses the grass to hide booby traps, therefore turning an environment which could have been used by Sam in a cool way into one used against him. Though hints are made at environments that have game mechanical novelties, none are really implemented in Pandora Tomorrow, but there are plenty of interesting atmospheric settings for stealth which go above and beyond the scope of the first game. It's not until Chaos Theory that environmental detail really starts to bring the levels to life, as well as provide unique interactions. We've mentioned the candles and paper doors in Hokkaido, but they don't just provide extra little mechanics. The way the light diffuses through the rooms is noticeably different in that level, due to the nature of the lighting and the translucent walls. In every level, the depth of environmental details brings it to life. The groaning, leaking setting of the cargo ship, surrounding Sam as he moves through its shadows like a ship easing through dark waters. The bygone age computer terminals in North Korea, the contrasting visual and spatial designs of the different sections of the bathhouse. The Clancy-esque level of detail in many parts of the levels works well with the slick, minimal UI. Even this aspect strives for thematic unity with that core experience. You need your gameplay free of clutter to better see the details, to better gather visual information, and to better see Sam's position relative to his enemies. Sneaking wonderfully beneath it all is the often highlighted procedural soundtrack by Amon Tobin, as well as, of course, listening extensively to the soundtracks for all 3 of the first Splinter Cell games while playing through them a number of times. I've also listened to each game's OST separately. Originally, I was going to listen to each game's soundtrack through a couple of times, and I did that for the first 2 games, but when I got to Chaos Theories, it was so good that I spent a long time with it. There is 1 track per level, and those tracks in themselves are banging, but the magic really happens in-game, where the slower, atmospheric portions of the level's track loop and wind back on themselves as Sam makes his way undetected through the level. But once Sam gets spotted, that's when the louder, more urgent portions of the track cycle in, perfectly reflecting the wave of anxious energy hitting the player as they cope with the rabble they've just accidentally roused. It's a perfect fit for Chaos Theory. The previous games did fine having separate short tracks for each level. Generally, one track for when Sam was completely in stealth, one for when guards were suspicious, and then one for out and out alert. But this approach did have a number of flaws, one being that if you spent a long time in one state, the same track would just play through over and over again. And this is obviously often going to be the case with the stealth track, at least one would hope. The other flaw is the abrupt change when you move up and down alert stages, particularly once you get detected. The sudden shifts up and down can break the immersion slightly, and Chaos Theory manages to solve this problem by having each track grow into louder phases more organically. The soundtrack for Chaos Theory and its implementation really is just about as good as it could possibly be. Aside from the stellar music, environmental noise also plays a role in Chaos Theory. A moment in the David Clayman review marks a rare occasion of IGN making a good point when he says, "Every aspect of the sound in Chaos Theory is top-notch. Environmental effects are incredibly detailed and include radio chatter, raindrops, wind and mechanic hums. The noises not only add to the atmosphere, but with the new sound meter they have become an important gameplay element." Although I'm not sure what mechanic hums are, this quote grasps the key point on the environmental sound, which is the unity between the sound and the game mechanics. Just as visual design elements are often consequential from a gameplay perspective, all environmental noise has a profound impact on the level of noise Sam can make while retaining stealth. The unity between visual and audio environment and the gameplay overall is deep and satisfying. With that, it's time to move on to the very last chapter of the review, which looks at the long-lost multiplayer modes. Though the single-player missions are Chaos Theory's beating heart, the game did also come with 2 multiplayer modes. Unfortunately, I never played these at the time, and with the servers now predictably unalive, it's no longer a possibility. It is apparently possible to get a working version of multiplayer up and running on the PC version after jumping through a number of technical hoops, as proven in Super Bunny Hop's video on the subject, which I'll link in the description for those interested. For the purposes of the review, I'm a sucker for a sense of completeness, but as I didn't play these modes myself, I'll instead describe the modes and give a summary of what the general critical and popular consensus was about them at the time. There are 2 modes. The first is a co-op mode, where you and a single friend take missions in a number of specifically designed maps. The gameplay remains largely unchanged from single player, but as you'd expect, the addition of an extra player makes new things possible. Coordinating takedowns, covering each other as you move through riskier areas of the map, having one guy remove an obstacle while the other seamlessly slips past it, and so on. There was also specific co-op moves available to do, mostly it seems as a means of accessing different kinds of traversal options. These seem to prefigure Army of Two, remember that game? And its co-op focused mechanics. The general consensus was that, although the gameplay was stellar, the mode was somewhat limited due to the small number of maps. As you can imagine, these maps were also not as complex or replayable as the high quality single player levels. This seemed like a nice supplement to the main game, but only that, definitely not the main dish. Lastly is the much beloved competitive mode introduced in Pandora Tomorrow, Spies vs Mercs. It's certainly a fantastic premise, a sort of asymmetrical versus mode where 2 players are mercs who try to hunt down and kill the 2 players who are spies, who in turn are trying to complete some kind of mission objective. Mercs have a small arsenal of weapons, but play in first person, and only have a flashlight as a means of navigating the shadowy areas of the maps. The spies play much like Sam does in the main game, but without his weapon options. The spies playing third person are more mobile and have nods, but no conventional weapons, only a taser, smoke and stun grenades, and a gadget that lets you listen to enemy comms. You can probably see the aim of the game for either side. The spies win by slipping past the mercs and achieving the mission objective of the map. The mercs win by defending the objectives, generally by finding the spies and filling them with bullets before they can fulfill their goals. It's unique, not just then, but even now. It's a bold and deep competitive mode, but somewhat flawed, particularly it seems when played in context of having experienced all the modern multiplayer quality of life features. Players often reported the immense sense of tension from having to hide from other human players, and completely novel strategies that develop around this novel mode, but also reported a high learning curve and general mechanical clunkiness. For more information on this, I'd strongly recommend checking out Super Bunny Hop's video. Like the co-op mode, the versus mode was icing on the already delicious cake that is the single player. They were just another way to enjoy a fantastic game. So time to finish up now with the rating. You shimmy, climb, drop down, your landings kept quiet from the hostiles making their rounds, and with secret feet follow their sad steps through dark alleyways or sterile compounds. Splinter Cell Chaos Theory is a game about the experience of being a covert agent, and almost every part of it is aligned brilliantly with the goal of delivering that experience. I think, along with a positive review and sincere recommendation to any fan of stealth, or really any fan of thoughtful action games, 2 stars are also deserved. For anyone watching who isn't aware of the rating system I use, please check out the post on my channel for an in-depth explanation. And with that, it's time to say goodbye. I hope you enjoyed the review. Stick around the channel for more. Until next time, take care.